Thank you, Omar. A warm welcome to you from around the world for this important Sabeel webinar on anti-Semitism. It's part of our series of pre-conference webinars with the overall focus on religious extremism, which we're going to address at our international conference in November in Palestine. We're going to be looking over the 3 main days of the conference at anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Christophobia, and the extremes of Zionism, Islamism, and Christian nationalism. So we're looking forward to the conference, and many of the speakers at our webinars will be attending and participating. So today is a taster for that. And we're delighted to have 4 speakers today: Omar Haramy, Father David Neuhaus, Rabbi Faryn Borella, and Hadar Cohen. I will introduce each of them when they are to speak. There'll be an opportunity for questions, Q&A, after the 4 people have spoken. Please place your questions in the chat so that we can put them together or direct them to individual speakers and maximize the opportunity we have to engage with them. And then at the end, Omar will wrap up and remind us with details of the conference in November. So our first speaker is Omar Haramy, Director of Sabeel in Jerusalem. And Omar is going to give us an overview of the Sabeel statement on anti-Semitism. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sizer. It's a pleasure to be with you all, friends. My name is Omar Haramy, and I've been part of the Sabeel family since 2006. Spent many years, had the blessing to be to learn from Reverend Naim Ati and many of the co-founders of Sabeel, like Cedar Davis, Sami Khouri, and amazing people who are also our friends, and we are still connected till this day. A number of years ago, I remember that Reverend Naim was launching one of his new books at that time, and a number of controversial discussions started, like, why is Reverend Naim invited to speak at this church or at this university to launch his book? And Reverend Naim was accused of being anti-Semitic or promoting anti-Semitism. So many of our friends felt very frustrated, and they said, you know, we know Reverend Naim, he's a nice person, he's not anti-Semitic. Sabeel should make a document that would help people to say that fighting or speaking on behalf of Palestine is not anti-Semitic. So at that time, I was in a conference. I was also encouraged by Reverend Sizer. I don't know if you remember, in the UK, at the end of a Friends of Sabeel conference, you also encouraged Sabeel to take over this difficult topic of studying anti-Semitism or addressing it. And I went back to Sabeel, and we asked the General Assembly, and people said that's a good thing to do. It's a good project. Why don't we take it on? And the first thing, you know, I thought, being very naive, I thought you just say, like, standing for Palestinian rights is something positive, and it's in line with human rights and international law. Being pro-Palestinian doesn't mean that you can be in any way anti-Semitic. And we condemn anti-Semitism, full stop, and there will be world peace. It was a little bit more complicated than this. Because when we started to meet, and we started to meet wonderful people, including Father David Neuhaus, to get their insight and for us, we all agreed maybe we need to study what is anti-Semitism so that we can make judgments of what is anti-Semitic and what is not. Sadly, in the Middle East, but also in Palestine, the topic of anti-Semitism is a very controversial topic. We do not learn about anti-Semitism. We actually don't learn much about World War II or the 21st century, a part of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we learn from the perspective of the Palestinian perspective. which is understandable to a certain extent. But it leaves us disconnected from major events that took in the 20th century. Sadly, in the 20th century, close to 1 million people, 100 million people got killed. And World War II was one of the wars where it showed that how evil people can become. And definitely the Holocaust is one of the ways that humans proved that we can be monsters, sadly. Not the only time in history, but in most recent history, it's one of the most frightening periods of our history. So we started to learn about anti-Semitism, and it wasn't an easy journey for us. Because for us, many Palestinians, anti-Semitism is always the introduction to the need of Zionism, and Zionism meant the Nakba for the Palestinians and our displacement. But we decided together with our friends and our colleagues, so many times we were on the defensive side. Sometimes we got frustrated from internal discussions, and we started to learn about anti-Semitism. And it was very difficult for us, especially as Palestinian Christians, where Christianity is also part of our identity. It's not only faith, it is part of our identity. And we saw that how the church has been and is complicit in anti-Semitism. So that's the second webinar that we're holding on the topic of anti-Semitism. The first webinar that we had, I think we did a very good job speaking about the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, which is, sadly, until this day, it's a very effective tool to try to silence and to bully anybody who would criticize the state of Israel. And that's true to us, but that's not the topic of this webinar. This webinar, we want to focus on anti-Semitism, on its roots, and to understand where does it really exist today. One of the things that I've learned that even if we say anti-Semitic stuff unintentionally, it still has the same impact and effect on the people who hear it. We Palestinian Christians, being Palestinian and being Christian too, a minority, we have a very sensitive ear. Being minority, you become extra sensitive. So everything might, it frightens you or makes you worried or hurts our feelings. Because minorities sadly rely on the ethics of the majority. And for all around the world, a part of Israel today, Jews have lived as a minority. And they have always, and living as a minority is not an easy thing. And people have, when people study history, and the Jewish people study the history is a big book. And it has plenty stories. Some are good, some are bad. But for us, we try as human people, we feel we go through traumas from the difficult periods, and the Jewish people have suffered. So what we want to do is that today we want to explain and to focus on the topic of anti-Semitism. So please let us forget the Palestine-Israeli conflict or the weaponizing of anti-Semitism. Not because it is irrelevant, not because it is true, but because it is this part of the story we have covered in the first session, and we will continue to cover it through the conference. But now, how can we really understand, as people who believe in human rights, who believe in that we as people are created in the image of God, we really need to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred around the world. So the first step, if you want to be we want to cleanse ourselves from these evil ideologies, we need to learn what anti-Semitism is, and this requires lots of time. I've spent 5 or 6 years, and I got very frustrated in this period of time. It's not an easy thing. It was easier for me to study chemistry and physics or the English language than to study anti-Semitism. And we have to understand that it's not like you read 2 books and then you become an expert on anti-Semitism or on any other topic. The more you learn, the more you understand that there is more need to learn. And when we learn about what anti-Semitism is, that it helps us to do self-reflection, I'm saying. We don't need the IHRA definition, but what we need to do is our own conscious. If we abide with certain values, we need to come and say, what are we saying or doing? Is it anti-Semitic? And even if it's not anti-Semitic, I think we need to go also to ask, could it be portrayed or misunderstood as anti-Semitic? And even though, can we come and say, even if it's not, and we believe what we're saying is very important or what we are doing, could it be also misunderstood as anti-Semitism? And I say it's because because of all the different identities that we hold, we all belong to certain minorities, even if we belong to, in general, to most of our identities are part of the majority, we all belong to different minorities. And minorities are vulnerable groups of people. And we need to understand, what are we doing? Are we being very proactive and effective in making this world a better place or a more difficult place? Are we contributing to the problem or contributing to the solution? I doubt that you will, by the end of this webinar, or even if you come to the conference, you will have perfect answers or formulas. We are more complicated than IKEA. IKEA gives you like a simple way. You can build a bed, you can build a table, you can build a desk. But with this, it really relies on you. You are the main filter or the lens, you and your own values, on helping to understand what we say is helpful or not. So thank you. I thought that this is an important discussion. And actually, one of the things I wanted to start to speak is because it is the most people, many of our friends who understand of the human rights violations that are taking in Palestine, they believe, or mistakenly, I think, they believe if they criticize actions of Palestinians or ideologies from Palestinians, they do harm for the Palestinian cause. People who are under occupation, who have been dispossessed, maybe going through a genocide. And I think that is not true. By holding one another accountable to our shared values that we all claim, as we all grow together as a movement and we become better agents to working together. So thank you, Stephen.
Omar, thank you very much for that very helpful, illuminating introduction, particularly the context of why we're addressing this subject within Sabeel. In the chat, I've put a hyperlink to where you can obtain a copy of the Sabeel reflection on anti-Semitism. It's called This Is Where We Stand, and you can obtain it from the Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA's website, as a PDF. So you can download it anywhere in the world, and the hyperlink is in the chat. So please check that. And if you haven't already got a copy or read a copy, please do so, because it's an indispensable preparation for our conference in November. Now, it's my delight to introduce Father David Neuhaus, who is going to speak on the history of anti-Semitism. David teaches at the Seminary of the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem and at the Silesian Theological Institute in Jerusalem, and he has published widely on scripture, interreligious dialogue, and the Middle East. So welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Stephen. As Omar has just explained and Stephen mentioned, in 2023, Sabeel published This Is Where We Stand, a Sabeel reflection on anti-Semitism. There is indeed something historic in the publication of this long 148-page document by a Palestinian center of reflection. At the book launch, I called the document Important, Courageous, Creative, Prophetic, and Complicated. And now I have been asked to briefly sketch the history of anti-Semitism, and I will try to do so. So, anti-Semitism is a 19th century term. Its evolution is intimately connected with the development of nationalism in Europe and the growing sentiment among some nationalists that Jews were alien to the nations that were evolving, German, French, Italian, English, etc. Anti-Semitism is a secular idea that posits the Jews as a distinct ethnic or racial group, sometimes based on modern theories of evolution, genetics, and biology. It is a distinct form of racism. However, from an historical point of view, anti-Semitism is closely tied to anti-Judaism, a theological construct that developed primarily in the Christian world. From the point of view of anti-Judaism, Jews were seen as those who rejected Jesus Christ, the Son of God, called for his death, making them God-killers, and stubbornly refused to accept that salvation was only through him. As a consequence, the people that had once been chosen by God was thought of as rejected and destined to wander the face of the earth, eternally cursed and homeless among peoples. The church replaced Israel as God's holy people. In Christendom, anti-Judaism too often and in too many places led to the socio-economic and political marginalization of Jews, discrimination against them, their expulsion and sometimes violence, persecution, and massacre. For the most part, Jews who converted to Christianity were no longer seen as Jews and were able to socially, politically, and economically integrate into general society. However, already in the 15th century, some argued that Jews were still suspect even after having become Christians because they did not have pure blood. That is the term that was used in Spain and Portugal. With the secularization of Europe, traditional anti-Judaism mutated for many into a new form of Jew hatred, anti-Semitism. The reason now for distrusting Jews, discriminating against them, and persecuting them was no longer formulated in uniquely theological terms. Rather, Jews were now seen in a negative light because of their supposed ethnic, cultural, or national otherness. According to ethnocentric nationalists, they constituted a threat to the modern nation, essentially traitors, supporting communism and capitalism, yes, both, as strategies to control the world through cosmopolitan ideologies that crushed the spirit of the particular nation. Anti-Semites tried to define Jews as fundamentally different, a difference that did not dissolve in waters of baptism or in bureaucratic processes of becoming citizens. One of the seminal cases of modern anti-Semitism was that of the French military captain Alfred Dreyfus, put on trial in 1894. Seeking the spy who had passed military secrets to the enemy, many in France became convinced that the spy was Dreyfus. This was not based on evidence, but on the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish and therefore, by definition, disloyal. The theme of disloyalty led anti-Semites to formulate conspiracy theories that the Jews were plotting to take over the world. To the crimes of disloyalty and conspiracy were added the crimes of disordered greed and sexual perversion. Jews are seeking to dominate the world in order to conquer unlimited wealth and sully our women. A sordid version of this theory was the basis of the book The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic classic. Pseudo-scientific theories of race determined that the Jews were an inferior race, characterized by materialism, legalism, and devoid of tolerance and morality. In the aftermath of the First World War and the crushing defeat of Germany and her allies, anti-Semitism was strengthened among those looking for a scapegoat for the woes of the post-war period. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party he founded became obsessed with Jews and vowed to destroy them. Coming to power in 1933 in Germany, the Nazis began a process of ridding Germany of its Jews. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and this speedy conquest of a huge part of Europe by the German army, the Nazis were able to broaden their campaign against Jews to other parts of Europe. In 1942, the Nazis formulated a final solution, a plan to rid Europe of its Jewish population. By the end of the war in 1945, the Nazis had succeeded in exterminating about 6 million Jews through deportations, massacres, state-sponsored starvation and spread of disease, and the development of an extermination industry that carried out a well-planned genocide. It was in the aftermath of discovering the proportions of the Shoah that many became sympathetic to the Jews and supported a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. In fact, towards the end of the 19th century, in the face of anti-Semitism, some Jews began to try and formulate a response to it. Some engaged in the fight against anti-Semitism in their own countries. Others proposed migration to countries in the New World, especially the United States, where anti-Semitism was supposedly less rife. And some proposed a Jewish nationalism, Zionism, in the image and likeness of similar European movements. It was founded on the premise that not only was anti-Semitism a threat to Jews, but that it could not and should not be fought against. Until the Shoah, many Jews rejected this ideology, preferring to fight for integration in their own countries. Zionism is a diverse ideological movement that seeks to mobilize Jewish religious consciousness, biblical texts about Palestine, and the plight of Jews facing anti-Semitism and persecution. Political Zionism, with its own organization, was established in the 1890s by Theodor Herzl and his collaborators. They proposed that anti-Semitism not be countered, but rather be mobilized to promote Zionism and its vision of a Jewish homeland. European-style anti-Semitism has unfortunately found supporters in the Arab world too. Quranic texts ripped out of context are brandished to promote religious hostility to Jews. Furthermore, myriad conspiracy theories about Jewish political and economic power incite some to hatred of Jews. However, some Zionists try to make every manifestation of support for Palestinians and their rights sound anti-Semitic. The current confusion between legitimate criticism of the State of Israel and its army and anti-Semitism is particularly unhelpful at this present time. Some ideological attempts to define anti-Semitism have created further confusion. However, ultimately, those fighting for the liberation of Palestinians and their right to equality, for justice and peace, must be on the same side as those fighting all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. In conclusion, it is important to note that anti-Judaism and anti-Islam, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are intimately linked. From a historical point of view, it is particularly pertinent to reflect on episodes like the Crusades and the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula. These significant moments of the expression of anti-Judaism were also peak moments in the development of anti-Islam. Likewise, the modern phenomenon of anti-Semitism is intertwined with the ideology of Islamophobia, as Muslims are characterized by the same tropes of hostility. Thank you very much.
Wow, David, thank you so much for that very comprehensive history of anti-Semitism. I was furiously taking notes, which I find very, very helpful indeed. I'm sure your presentation has raised questions in some of our minds. So please, if you have a question for David, please put it down in the chat and we'll make notes of the questions asked, and we'll be putting them to David and our other speakers after they have spoken. So thank you very much, David. Our next speaker is Rabbi Faryn Borella, and Faryn is going to be speaking about the experience of anti-Semitism. Rabbi Faryn has worked and lived in Jerusalem as an activist, journalist, and photojournalist, and she has worked with Fosner to expand the reach of Palestinian liberation theology in US seminaries, as well as the Sabeel Ecumenical Center, working on the subject of anti-Semitism. And Faryn presently serves as a rabbi of Or Shalom Jewish community in San Francisco. Welcome, Faryn.
Great, it wasn't letting me unmute. Hi, everyone. So my presentation is not nearly as formal as Father David's, which was really comprehensive and profound and really touched on a lot of different aspects of the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So thank you so much for that. And I think the ask was, you know, as a Jewish person and as a Jewish person who's been involved in the struggle for Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation for over a decade now, you know, there's this question of what is my experience of anti-Semitism as a Jewish person who's also holding a framework that not all criticism of the state of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. Stephen was talking a little bit about my history. So I was in Jerusalem in the summer of 2019 helping with, I think what was more the beginning of this project of Sabeel creating this statement on anti-Semitism. I had gotten a grant from Fosnet to come, and they'd asked that I worked with Sabeel, and Omar reached out to me, and we hadn't met before, but he was like, here's the project I want you to help us with and to work on when you're here in Jerusalem. We want to create a statement and a document and a resource on anti-Semitism for Palestinian civil society, because we think it's really important that Palestinian civil society understand how anti-Semitism operates in order to ensure that our struggle for liberation isn't playing into anti-Semitic tropes and bolstering anti-Semitism. And I found that to be just such a moving ask. And throughout that summer that I was working with Sabeel on this project, part of my role was to go and speak with Israeli scholars of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust about their understanding. And, you know, sometimes the understandings that those scholars were sharing with me didn't fit with my picture of anti-Semitism. They were more right-wing. They were more playing into the idea that any criticism of Israel or Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. And it was actually Omar who challenged me to be more open and to really hear them and to really hear a more expansive view and definition of anti-Semitism than I was willing to believe at the time. So I'm grateful to Omar and to this project for supporting me in my genesis and my learning around this topic as well. So I think what I'll say is that I think what I wanted to speak about a little bit today is that while I think the biggest threat, especially I live in the United States, I live in San Francisco and unceded Ohlone land. And here in the United States, the biggest threat of anti-Semitism is coming from white supremacists and white supremacy. Like that is, when we think about violence that could come against the Jews, that violence is most likely to come from Trump, from white supremacists who think that Jews are, as Father Neuhaus was saying, are controlling the world, are helping immigrants get in, are supporting the liberation of Black people. It's seen as like Jews are the ones pulling the strings that are ruining white America. And so I think the biggest threat of violence toward Jews in the United States context is coming not from the left, not from the Palestinian liberation movement, but from the right. However, I think what I do want to speak about is, as someone who works on the left and serves a congregation that's on the left and works in movements for justice here in the United States, is the way in which anti-Semitism can creep into our movements, can creep into our rhetoric, and can soil the really good work we're doing in support of the collective liberation of all peoples. And so an example, you know, I've been getting all sorts of weird things as a rabbi of a congregation over the last year, and especially since October 7th, when everything was heightened. But an example that I'm thinking of right now is I've been reached out to by so many strangers to talk about so many things. But I was reached out to by someone who ran a group called Interfaith for Palestine somewhere in Europe, who was like, I want to talk to a rabbi about the ongoing genocide. And I was like, okay, can you tell me more? Why did you come to me? What do you want to talk about? And it was, you know, a white man somewhere in Europe. And his response was, you know, Jews and the Jewish state are killing Palestinians and are entirely responsible, and therefore I need to talk to a rabbi because all Jews and all Jewish people support this. And I think what I'm seeing a lot these days is the conflation of what Israel is doing and then making that say Jews are doing this. And I think that is really dangerous, because we have a political body, a national body that is enacting a lot of harm, and that does claim to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, which is where the slippery slope comes from. But when it becomes Jews are the powerful ones that are controlling the world, and Jews are ultimately and exclusively responsible for what is happening in Gaza right now, Jews at large, not Israel, not the Israeli state, not the Israeli military, but Jews, that I think is where we get into dangerous territory. And I think especially when it's said that it's exclusively Jews and they're not thinking about the larger power structures at play, such as the United States upholding of, you know, the United States is the one that's ultimately arming Israel to the gills and making what's happening in Gaza right now possible, as we saw in Rafah recently. And I'm not sure if Father David mentioned this, but one primary way that anti-Semitism has manifested historically, especially in Christian Europe, is that Jews were used as a buffer class between the ruling class, which was white Christians, and minority classes that were considered even more inferior to Jews. So Jews were used to be the face of the oppression. They were the tax collectors. They were the ones who, sorry, I'm losing my voice. They were the ones who were the face of the oppressive policies on behalf of a ruling class. And the way Israel functions in the world today is that Western powers want a strong Israel in the Middle East because they want a foothold in the Middle East from which they can have power in that area, in the oil industry. They want a military and socio-political outpost, and therefore the support of Israel is perhaps, you know, because they support the Jews. But I think much more likely it's like they are using the Jews to have a foot in the happenings of the Middle East. And therefore it's just another incidence of Jews and a state of the Jews being used to oppress another people on behalf of a more powerful people. And it makes invisible what's actually going on, that this is so much more than Jews and the Jewish state harming Palestinians, but it's actually Jews being like kind of the foot soldiers of a much larger like Western imperial project. And so I think what I find really dangerous in these times is that slippery slope where Jews and only Jews get exclusively blamed, especially by those on the left, for what is happening. And while I don't feel personally threatened with violence by the people who are reifying this idea, I think it emboldens white supremacists and people on the right who do want to act violently toward Jews, toward Palestinians, toward Black people, toward Indigenous people, toward whoever. It emboldens them. So if we in our movements and we on the left are reifying and upholding anti-Semitism, it's going to embolden the people who actually want to act violently toward Jews and toward other minorities. And so I think it's really important that as we struggle for Palestinian rights, we are doing so in a framework of collective liberation. And we're saying, okay, if Zionism is something that is oppressing Palestinians and that currently doesn't actually seem to be keeping Jews safe either, then how can we support Jews in finding an alternative that keeps them safe and doesn't contribute to the oppression of another people? We need to include Jews in this vision of collective liberation and see our liberation is bound up in the liberations of all people. Because if we don't, Jews are going to keep clinging to a hyper-militarized Israel as like their only mechanism to safety if they don't see other peoples as thinking their safety is important. And so I think that it's really important that we see that in our movements and that we don't be saying things like, I'm hearing things such like, they just need to go back where they came from. But like Father David spoke about that, most of the places where Jews came from are no more. So we can't just say, oh, Israelis have to go back where they came from. We have to really grapple with the fact that there are now third generation Jews living in Palestine, living in Israel, that don't have anywhere else to go, and telling them to go back where they came from is playing into anti-Semitism. And so I think what I ask of our movements for Palestinian liberation and Palestinian rights is that they take into account that Jewish safety and Jewish liberation is bound up in Palestinian liberation, and the only way to Palestinian liberation is to seriously grapple with how Jews will also be safe in that struggle. So I have lots of examples of how that's popped up in the day-to-day of being a congregational rabbi of a synagogue that supports a ceasefire. But I'll pause for now and look forward to the Q&A.
Faryn, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your work with Sabeel in preparing the This Is Where We Stand booklet. We're very grateful to you for that. And some very profound things you said, particularly about the dangers of conflating Israel with Jews. And that's something some Zionists do intentionally. It's very important and dangerous to equate the two. That's why it's so important that we do distinguish Jewishness from Israel. And I really liked your comments about collective liberation. And that's something very dear to my heart, particularly when we're exploring the one democratic state as an alternative to the two-state solution. As you said, we've got to help our Jewish sisters and brothers find an alternative to a hyper-weaponized Israel or Zionism. So thank you very much, Faryn, for your very challenging but very helpful and constructive experience. We are now going to turn to our final speaker, Hadar Cohen. Hadar is an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, and artist, and founder of Malshut. I think I pronounced that right, or Malkut, a spiritual skill-building school teaching Jewish mysticism and direct experience of God. Hadar is a 10th generation Jerusalemite with lineage roots also in Syria, Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran. So thank you, Hadar. Welcome, and we look forward to what you're going to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Hadar, and Thank you so much, Omar and Father David and Rabbi Faryn, for all of your very eloquent remarks. It's always such an honor to be weaved in with Sabeel. And yeah, I want to add a few things. One thing that I have found very critical for me in the last, not just few months, but really few years, because the reality on the ground is just so absolutely horrifying, with the levels of oppression and suffering. And it's very easy to get so bound up in the pain cycles and the traumas, and that leads us sometimes to psychologically attack or project or blame or defend, and all of kind of those psychological patterns that to me keep us bound in the same cyclical violence. And part of my spiritual practice is to actually, okay, let's pause from all the viciousness that is there and actually like imagine and put a platform out of what is it that we really want? What is, to me, right, that comes from God's missions and God's purpose for this land, for our people, for the community. And this is where it feels really vital that we really, really strengthen the multi-religious coalitions everywhere in Palestine, on the ground, and also internationally. What is it like to not just, say all people deserve equality, but to actually build and contribute to that building of a society in which all religions are protected, whether you are Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Baha'i or any other faith, and to really practice living that way, not just as an idea, but to actually embody that. So I'm really grateful for this series. A little bit about my background. I was born in Jerusalem. My family's been there for over 10 generations. So I grew up with, just so many stories of very deep relationships that my grandparents had with their Palestinian neighbors. And, my grandma, till the day she died, had many Palestinian friends. And, from my other side of my family, from Kurdistan, from Syria, from Iraq. And, it's really interesting when you look at Arab Jewish histories and traditions, we actually have so many holidays that are shared between our neighbors, between our Muslim and Christian neighbors. For example, Mimuna, which is the end of the holiday of Passover, was usually a multi-religious celebration. And one of the things that frustrates me sometimes with the discourse, especially around the Middle East and Arab countries, is that Avi Shlaim, he's an Arab Jewish scholar. He says this phrase, which I think a lot about, around how, the ruptures that happen weren't just physical and, ripping out of the Jews from the Muslim world and from the Arab world and from, the Middle East, but it was also a certain rupture of history. It was certain like forgetting of history, of like what actually happened to our communities, and the ways in which European anti-Semitism was really imported into the Middle East and really like integrated. A lot of people internalized the European anti-Semitism that was fed. That was a very much like sophisticated plan that European colonial powers had. I mean, and they didn't just do that with the Jews in the lands, right? We can see that also in India and Pakistan and Algeria, and there's so many different examples of how colonialism specifically divides between religious communities and pits them as enemies and uses religion into that. So I think we have to be very careful to not adopt that and to actually resist that religious division that happens. And that sometimes I feel like there's an inaccuracy of portraying of history. That doesn't mean to say that, okay, everything was all right for Jews in the Middle East, but it is true, for me personally, speaking to my dad, speaking to my grandparents about their time in Kurdistan, like they moved to Jerusalem in the 50s, and their story is that very much the community mourned for them when they left. They didn't want them to leave, and that there was such a shared care for one another. And I think that that's something that has been ingrained in me and passed on through my ancestors. And I find that a lot that's shared with a lot of Arabs who are Muslims or Christians, you know, whether they're Palestinian or not Palestinian as well, like, you know, Iraqis and Moroccans, like there's a certain longing for the Jewish community. Not everywhere, not by everyone, but that's certainly there. And I think that for me, part of the liberation of Palestine and liberation of the Palestinian peoples is similar to what Rabbi Faryn said, is this reimagining and re-understanding of Jewish safety and Jewish belonging. And I think that the creation of the State of Israel had this vision for Jewish people to basically be segregated from the rest of the world, right? To have this modern nation state that was just going to be Jewish only, and then, you know, basically Jewish life everywhere else wouldn't be as relevant anymore. And I think that there's so much sadness for me in that, because I actually still think of Baghdad as a Jewish city. You know, pre-48, it was 40% Jewish. And now very little Jews live there. And same thing, you know, with Cairo and all of these cities that have such deep Jewish history. So for me, you know, the question of Palestinian liberation has to also come with this question of like, well, what does it look like to integrate Jewish people into the Middle East again? What does it look like to reactivate some of the synagogues that exist all over in Lebanon and, you know, and all of these countries? Like, what does that actually mean to support Jewish presence and Jewish life there, as a place of, right, shared multi-religious society? That might feel like a very far away long vision, but for me, it feels very imperative that we hold on to a multi-religious future, not just for Palestine, but for the whole region, because it all feels very much interconnected. And I guess the last thing that I'll share is that I also, you know, between Jewish people and Palestinian people, like these are both communities that have suffered so much historically and are small groups of people, you know, for each group, it's like 15 million total in the world. And I think that, I mean, there's a lot to say about Jewish trauma also being, right, transferred onto Palestinian people, but there's also so much that is actually shared in our trauma responses and our understandings of whether it's exile and displacement or violence and all of that. And I guess part of my hope in this horrifying time that we are in is that we find a way to actually be together again and to, you know, right before this, I was actually reading one of Hannah Arendt's pieces that came out in 1944 about Jews and anti-Semitism in Germany. And one of the things that she talks about very eloquently when she talks about, you know, Jewish belonging, right? Because I think any people who are oppressed, it's kind of like there's different choices to make around how do you want to relate to that oppression and how do you want to fight for that oppression, for the liberation. And one of the things that she distinguished is that, you know, there's one way of Jews liberating themselves through becoming part of the human family again, right? Reasserting themselves as human and being part of humanity. And then there's the other path, which is like being, you know, liberating themselves through actually becoming the oppressor, through actually becoming, you know, what the Europe nation states did to the Jews. So there's kind of this paralleling of oppression. And I think for me, you know, that actually in some ways perpetuates anti-Semitism, right? It's like the oppression of Jews then kind of being woven with the oppressor. And to me, fighting anti-Semitism is actually this question of like, well, how do Jews become human again in the eyes of everybody, in the eyes of themselves and in the eyes of all people? And in general, I think that is the way for all oppressed people, right? Is that like, the question is like, how do we be woven back in to humanity, to this, you know, human, as opposed to this specific nationalistic group? Because to me, that is going to lead to, you know, the cycle shifting and maybe different roles, different powers and all of that. So I think finding the way towards the human family again and building this multi-religious vision that we so desperately need. So I'll pause there, but thank you so much for having me. It's all, again, always such an honor to be here.
Hadar, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your family history. What I take away from your presentation is your vision and your longing for a future where Jews and Arabs and Palestinians can live together in harmony wherever they want to live, whether they want to go back to their roots in Iran, Iraq, and so on, or Egypt, and find care for one another as the way forward. It was very, very helpful, and also your observation that anti-Semitism was imported into the Middle East from Europe. It's certainly been my experience of, the presence of Jewish communities right across the Middle East were emptied after the Holocaust, after the appalling anti-Semitism that we saw in Europe. Yes, so thank you very much, Hadar, for that presentation, and we look forward to your participation, hopefully, in the conference too in November. There are one or two questions that have been raised. When we've addressed them, I'd really like David and Faryn and Hadar and Omar to interact with each other. If you've got questions for one another, please throw them into the melting pot. The first, it was more of an observation than a question, and it was really to David, and that was whether your text of your presentation will be made available. Can you well, this is true for all of our speakers. Are you able to provide Omar with an outline of your presentation so that it can be shared as part of this webinar? That's the first question to all of you. There was a question to Faryn from Virginia, if I can find it. I had it and I've lost it. It was about your observation about the danger of conflating Israel with the Jews. Faryn, how would you respond to the observation that it's equally dangerous to conflate all that's happened in Gaza with Hamas, or to draw it a little further, to equate all that Hamas did with Palestinians? Would you like to comment on that? That was from Virginia.
Sure. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I feel like the observation is apt, right? Like, just in the way that like, yes, the state of Israel is considered a Jewish state. There's now a nation state law that went from making like the idea that it was a state for the Jews to a Jewish state enshrined in law. And that is problematic, but that does not mean that every single Jew worldwide, one, has power or control over what the Jewish state does, or two, supports what it does, and therefore placing blame on every single Jew for the actions of a state body is wrong. Like, similar to with Hamas. I think that there are some people who think that Hamas is a liberation movement. There are some people that think Hamas is a terrorist organization. The fact of the matter is that it is the political body that rules over Gaza. It is a governmental structure in addition to whatever else you think it might be. And in the same way that Israel does not represent all Israelis or all Jews, like Hamas as a governmental body does not represent all Palestinians. And whether or not you agree or don't agree with Hamas's policies and actions, and I think that there is room for a lot of criticism and responsibility that Hamas holds for what is happening to the people of Gaza right now. You can't conflate their actions and their choices with what the entirety of the Palestinian people want and need. And I think plenty of people didn't support Hamas before October 7th. That number is far higher now. There's less support for Hamas in Gaza, is my understanding now, than ever before. And at the same time, this idea that you can root out or eliminate Hamas, which is the military strategy of the Israeli government right now, is impossible. There's no kind of elimination of Hamas, because that's kind of saying that you can eliminate an entire governing structure, that you can eliminate It's so much more interwoven. And so while not all Palestinians are a part of Hamas, there's not really, and you can't just like siphon it off and like eliminate it altogether. And so I think we need to just in general like complexify the fact that like political parties and political actors represent peoples as a whole and rather see people as individuals with different political aspirations. And I do think that the more kind of othered people are, like the more that we other people, the more that we tend to collapse them and think of them as a homogenous whole. So we need to like build intimacy with groups of people in order to understand the diversity that exists within them rather than kind of collapsing them into one. They all are like this, which I think happens a lot when we other people.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Sorry,
for that.
Stephen,
Yes.
may I just make a comment that probably will not be very popular, but I think that we need to even do that with Hamas itself. What Rabbi Faryn just said. We know, and this is a fact, that what happened on October the 7th, the absolute horror, catastrophe of October the 7th, that was not all committed by Hamas. The breaks in the fence led to hordes and hordes of people coming through. And within Hamas, there is an incredible diversity of attitudes to what happened on what has been happening over the past months. So I would suggest that we don't even collapse Hamas into one homogeneous. I also want to point out that for years and years and years, decades, Israel refused to talk to the Palestine Liberation Organization, saying it was a terrorist organization. And I fear that the same strategy is now being adopted with regard to Hamas, which, by the way, Israel has been speaking to since it was founded. But this is a kind of, again, a demagoguery that pushes us more and more into the logic of war.
Thank you, David. One of the questions probably is pertinent to you, and that is someone has said, so anti-Semitism, this is from Corey, anti-Semitism is a modern secular outcome of prior Christian anti-Judaism. Do you see it in that way?
You know, when you try to be very clear, you immediately betray the complexity of reality. So it's not like anti-Judaism was founded with Christianity, and it's not like there is only anti-Semitism growing out of Christian anti-Judaism. But I would say that if we are to do a very brief summary, then Christendom plays an incredibly important role in the vehicling of anti-Judaism, and the European nationalist movements play a very important role in vehicling anti-Semitism. So it's to say, no, not every single iota, but overwhelmingly, yes.
Thank you. Question for Hadar from Ellie. The Lebanese writer Elias Khoury said that the Middle East was emptied of its Jews first, and with Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda is emptied of its the Christians. Can you relate to this from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard to understand the dynamics in the Middle East, especially religiously, without really looking at European colonialism and US imperialism and how it affected the region. Yeah, there's a great book that I would recommend called The Middle East Crisis Factory by Iyad al-Baghdadi and Ahmed Gatnash, who look at all of the different ways in which different extremist groups in the Middle East got formed and some of the histories of that. And I think that, you know, like Palestine, Jewish people, like we are not the only issues in the Middle East, unfortunately. There's so many persecuted people of different tribes, different ethnicities, different religions. And to me, I feel that anti-Semitism is not necessarily separated out from other forms of oppression in the region, but I actually see them as interconnected with similar systems. And I would like to see the discourse around anti-Semitism be more integrated into relationship with oppression of other groups. And to my knowledge, that's what scholars also of the Middle East have said about anti-Semitism in the region, in which, you know, in Europe, it was very much a systematic issue against Jewish people as Jews. And when there was anti-Semitism in the Middle East, it was actually fundamentally different than it was in Europe. And when Jews were targeted, they were targeted as minority groups, similar in ways that Baha'is are targeted, or Kurdish folks are targeted, or you know, different people. So there was a lot more shared solidarity in that way. So I think we have to not necessarily just like single out as like just of the Jewish people, but also understand some of the other struggles of other people in the region and how that's interconnected.
Thank you, Hadar. We've got just a few minutes before Omar concludes and plugs the conference. Do you, David, Faryn, or Hadar, have a question for one another based on the presentations you heard?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I've been really impressed by the conversation. And I think in the darkness that almost enshrouds us all, there has been some wonderful light shed tonight. And I want to thank Rabbi Faryn and Hadar. It has been wonderful and an honor to participate with you.
David, thank you. Faryn or Hadar, would you like to either ask a question or make a final statement or summary?
Not sure what I want to say. Well, I guess I'm, you know, Hadar was speaking a bit about kind of historically what the relationships were like between, you know, Jews and non-Jews, whether Muslim or Christian or other, in Jerusalem. And, you know, you know, post the founding of the state, a lot of those relationships were much more strained than they were prior to the founding of the state. And I'm just curious, like Father David and Omar, you know, I haven't been in Jerusalem since the beginning of this latest onset of violence, and I'm curious to hear just what are you seeing relationally, thinking of what Hadar was speaking about as building that multi-religious beloved community. We're so far from that right now, but I'm curious what you're seeing in Jerusalem right now in terms of relationships between people of different faiths, and both the hard parts, and if you're seeing any hope as well in those relationships at this moment.
I'm staying silent and letting Omar speak.
David, yes.
Omar. I mean, we're living in a broken world today. So I don't think that Jerusalem is, with all of the tension that is taking place in Jerusalem, we also sense this tension, for example, in the US. The divisions are very strong in the US. The divisions are very strong in the UK. The divisions are also very strong in the Middle East. Our communities are not working perfectly on this world. I think and I think to create a world, we're not able to create a world. We don't have this power. This is the power of the creator. What we have power is like, what kind of an influence would I want to be in this part of the world? This is where I have control. I have control over myself to a certain extent. I mean, the environment that I live in impacts how I behave. So when there is a lot of violence by Israeli soldiers, I feel very angry. I don't feel like a person who wants to go and reach out to my Jewish neighbor. You know, I'm a person who's angry with my neighbor. So it's a journey, and we have to make a decision. You know, it is either we continue fighting and be part of a cycle, a continuous cycle. And I mean, it is, even if we defeat one enemy, we're going to create another enemy. Our anger and our frustration will lead us into this. Or we try to create examples of people who are proactive, trying to make the world a better place. None of these two choices are wonderful choices. Both require lots of energy and frustration. And honestly, we don't have the time and the energy to invest in all of these things, but we don't have the option. It's a bigger risk not to invest in them.
Hadar, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted, I don't know if it's so much of a question, but I just wanted to name like how heartbreaking it is to actually be a Jewish person right now. And I think Rabbi Faryn mentioned this, you know, because sometimes there's kind of this like, oh, the Jews can stop this, the Jews can do this, it's a Jewish state, all of that. But, you know, it feels so heartbreaking to be in this moment and be a Jewish person and want such a different vision for Jewish people, for Palestinian people, for the world. And yeah, just see so many war crimes being justified in the name of Judaism and just how gutting that is. You know, one of the things that I love about Sabeel is just the spiritual lineage of it. And for me, you know, my grandfather always taught, he was a prayer leader, and he always taught me that devotion to God and our Judaism was really about love of humanity and love of all people. And I just pray that that is, you know, the message and the teachings that come through and touch the hearts of the people, is this reconnecting to understanding like devotion to God and whatever faith, whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, whatever it is that you are, is that we somehow find this love for all people, and let that lead.
Thank you, Hadar, very much. Omar, back to you to conclude and tell us more about the conference.
We have decided to be on a journey that, like, especially people of faith, that religion should be a place where we become better neighbors, we become better human beings, even before we become better neighbors. And we should make sure that religion should not be used or abused to justify any form of violence or genocide or apartheid or oppression. But also religion, if we don't want religion to be used as a tool for oppression, we have to use religion for a good cause, which is being good neighbors, showing mercy, practicing forgiveness, encouraging people to stand for beautiful values as justice and peace. So we've debated, because we all want to be fanatics. You know, religious extremism could be something positive. We all want to be like extremist in love, extremist in compassion, extremist in forgiveness. We don't want to be violent, and we don't want to be aggressive and hateful. So we're a journey that we do it as a community, as Sabeel, and with other people of faith, so that may we strengthen one another on this journey, and may we also entertain one another on this journey, and may we also protect one another from ourselves and from our communities, the people that we are journeying with. This is a shared planet. We all live on this planet. There is some wisdom by the Creator to create us very diverse and very weird people that are not always behaving in the ways that we preach. So this is what we're inviting you for. We're inviting you to be together in person, not only about talking with each other, but also being with each other, having the conversations, listening to each other, and also challenging one another. It's exactly like challenging one another in the chat. I saw a number of places. I think we should not be ashamed to say that we don't know enough about one another. We don't know what about ourselves, and we need to be challenged, but also we have a responsibility to challenge one another, so that we are all better neighbors. Because I really believe at Sabeel, and this is what has always been taught to us, that relationships have to be genuine, and genuine relationships are difficult relationships. But it takes time, and it takes investment. And this is what we're asking you to do, to be with us this November, to guide us, to support us, and to support yourself. So I hope that many of you who are able to make it to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to Palestine, to Israel, please do it. It's a time of war, and it's a friend. And times like this, friends are needed. So as international friends, we need your help also to be with us as Palestinians, as Israelis, to be one group of people being together. So I hope many of you are able to make it, do make it this November to the Sabeel conference. We've had multiple webinars. We're also considering to do more webinars as a preparation for the conference. And we appreciate your presence with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I think we've brought our webinar to a close. Thank you so much to our speakers, to Omar, David, Faryn, and Hadar. And thank you, participants. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. Good day and God bless.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank you, friends.